April 20th, 1945. Berlin. 50 feet below the shattered chancellery gardens of the dying Third Reich, a bizarre and pathetic ceremony is about to take place. It is Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. A small collection of the last Nazi paladins, Goebbels, Bormann, Himmler, Göring, have gathered in the cramped, concrete corridors to offer congratulations to their Führer. The air is thick with the dust of falling buildings and the stench of diesel fumes from the bunker's overworked ventilation system. Above them, the city is a charnel house, a landscape of fire and ruin where the last remnants of the German army, now composed of old men and terrified children, are being systematically annihilated by the legions of the Red Army. The percussive thunder of Soviet artillery is no longer a distant threat. It is a constant, physical presence, a tremor that runs through the very foundations of the bunker itself. But down here, in this subterranean tomb, a grotesque fantasy is being maintained. The generals present maps showing armies that no longer exist, planning counterattacks with divisions that have been reduced to a few hundred exhausted men. Hitler, a man now physically and mentally ruined, stooped, sallow-skinned, his body racked by tremors he can barely control, speaks of a final, miraculous victory. He believes that the death of the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, just 8 days earlier, is a sign from Providence, a repeat of the miracle of the House of Brandenburg that saved Frederick the Great in the 18th century. He is certain the Allied coalition is about to shatter, that the British and Americans will, at any moment, join him in a holy crusade against the Bolshevik hordes from the east. This was the ultimate and most profound battle of Hitler's life, and it was fought not on the plains of Russia or the beaches of Normandy, but in the final, decaying inches of his own mind. It was a battle between his fanatical, messianic self-belief and the inexorable, crushing reality of total defeat. For the last 10 days of his life, the Führerbunker would become a theater of the absurd, a concrete sarcophagus where the Wagnerian opera of the Third Reich would descend into a squalid, claustrophobic, and deeply human tragedy of paranoia, betrayal, suicide, and murder. The enemy was no longer at the gate, he was on the doorstep, fighting for the bridges over the Spree River just a few miles away. And inside, the man who had plunged the world into the abyss was preparing for his own final, nihilistic act. This is the story of that descent, the hour-by-hour chronicle of the downfall. The birthday celebration, on April 20th, was the final, hollow performance of a royal court that knew it was doomed. For the senior Nazis who had gathered to pay homage, it was not a day of celebration, but a day of decision. One by one, the rats began to desert the sinking ship. Hermann Göring, the Sybaritic Reichsmarschall and Hitler's designated successor, came to say his farewells. He had already packed his priceless art collections and was preparing to flee south to Bavaria, ostensibly to rally a non-existent, national redoubt in the Alps. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS and the architect of the Holocaust, also made his excuses and departed, not to command a final glorious battle, but to commit the ultimate act of treason, to secretly open negotiations with the Western Allies through the Swedish Red Cross. Even Hitler's own personal physician, the quack Dr. Theodor Morell, who had for years kept the Führer functioning with a daily cocktail of amphetamines, opiates, and stranger concoctions, would soon pack his bags and abandon his most important patient. Their departure marked a fundamental shift in the atmosphere of the bunker. The last, thin pretense of a functioning government vanished. What remained was a claustrophobic inner sanctum, a squalid court of true believers, sycophants, and the damned. The only senior Nazi of the old guard to remain was the diminutive, club-footed master of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, who had moved his wife and 6 young children into the upper bunker, a decision that would seal their horrific fate. The true power in the bunker, however, now resided with the man who never left Hitler's side, the shadowy and universally despised head of the party chancellery, Martin Bormann. Bormann was the gatekeeper, the spider at the center of the web, controlling all access to Hitler, filtering all information, and jealously guarding his proximity to a source of power that was now confined to a few damp, concrete rooms. It was in this hermetically sealed world of paranoia and delusion that the final, decisive military conference took place on April 22nd. The Red Army had now fully encircled Berlin. The city was a Festung, a fortress, but it was a fortress with no hope of relief. During the daily situation conference, Hitler was informed that a planned counterattack by an SS detachment under General Felix Steiner, an attack upon which Hitler had pinned all his fantastical hopes for the relief of Berlin, had not, and could not, materialize. The units were a fiction. The men did not exist. For the first time, the brutal physical reality of their predicament seemed to penetrate the thick walls of Hitler's delusion. The reaction was volcanic. Hitler exploded in a screaming, tearful rage, a paroxysm of fury that stunned even those who were accustomed to his tirades. He denounced the army, he denounced the SS, he denounced the German people as unworthy of his genius. He screamed that he had been betrayed from the beginning. And then, something snapped. For the first time, he openly and publicly admitted the truth. "The war is lost," he declared, his voice a hoarse whisper. He announced that he would not flee Berlin. He would stay in the capital to the end and, when that end came, he would shoot himself. The spell was broken. The Wagnerian opera was over. The squalid, final act of suicide and self-immolation was about to begin. Hitler's declaration of April 22 plunged the Führerbunker into a state of suspended animation, a surreal limbo between the violent death of the city above and the quiet, methodical preparations for suicide below. The collapse of the Führers will had a cascading effect. The military adjutants, men like General Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, who had for years been the dutiful transmitters of his commands, were now rudderless. After a final, emotional farewell, they were dismissed, ordered to fly south to coordinate a non-existent final defense with the remnants of the army. Their departure was a final severing of the bunker's connection to the German military. What remained was a skeleton staff, a handful of loyal SS guards, and the inner circle, all now simply waiting for the end. In this atmosphere of impending doom, the court of the dying king took on a macabre, theatrical quality. Normal routines were bizarrely maintained. Secretaries continued to type, telephone operators manned their switchboards, and the SS orderlies served tea and meals with formal precision, even as the walls trembled from the ceaseless Soviet bombardment. Hitler himself retreated further into his own private world. He spent hours staring at a portrait of his hero, Frederick the Great, or quietly sitting with his Alsatian dog, Blondie, to whom he seemed to show more affection than to any human being. He would emerge from his private quarters to take meals with his two remaining secretaries and his vegetarian cook, the conversation stilted and focused on trivialities, a desperate attempt to maintain a facade of normalcy while the world burned down around them. The first major act of this final drama was one of betrayal. On April 23, a decoded telegram arrived in the bunker from Hermann Göring in Bavaria. Believing Hitler to be incapacitated and cut off in Berlin, Göring, citing the 1941 succession decree, formally requested permission to take over leadership of the Reich. Hitler's reaction was one of pure, venomous rage. To him, this was not a legalistic inquiry. It was a high-stakes coup, a stab in the back from the man he had once trusted above all others. Egged on by the malevolent Martin Bormann, who saw his own chance to eliminate a rival, Hitler flew into a fury, denouncing Göring as a traitor and a lazy, corrupt morphine addict. He immediately had Göring stripped of all his titles, expelled from the Nazi Party, and issued an order for his arrest and execution. The first of his paladins had been purged. The bunker's residents, now completely cut off from the outside world except for a single, tenuous radio link, descended into a state of paranoia. Hitler saw traitors everywhere. He began to suspect that even his elite SS guards might be planning to drug him and hand him over to the Soviets. It was in this climate of absolute distrust that he made his next critical decision, one that would seal not only his own fate, but that of the woman who had, for 14 years, been his silent and largely invisible companion. He decided it was time to get married. The end was no longer a matter of days, it was a matter of hours. And the man who had always claimed to be married only to Germany decided to reward his most loyal follower with a ceremony at the edge of the abyss. In the final, suffocating hours of the Third Reich, as the Soviet 150th Rifle Division fought its way into the Reichstag just a few hundred yards away, the inhabitants of the Führerbunker retreated from the apocalyptic reality above into a series of bizarre, ritualistic ceremonies. The most surreal of these was the marriage of Adolf Hitler to Eva Braun. Braun, a former shop assistant from Munich, had been Hitler's mistress for over a decade, a vapid, apolitical figure who had been kept almost entirely hidden from the German public. But she had displayed one quality that Hitler now prized above all others: absolute, unquestioning loyalty. She had voluntarily flown into the besieged city of Berlin in mid-April to be with him at the end, a decision that had deeply moved the increasingly paranoid Führer. He now saw it as his duty to reward her devotion with a proper, legal union before their deaths. Shortly after midnight, in the early hours of April 29th, a small, grim party gathered in the bunker's small conference room. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann stood as the official witnesses. The groom, dressed in his usual black trousers and gray military jacket, his face a pale, slack mask of exhaustion. The bride, Eva Braun, wore a black silk dress, her favorite. A minor municipal official named Walter Wagner, who was also a member of the local Nazi party militia, had been located in a nearby cellar during a lull in the shelling and brought to the bunker to perform the civil ceremony. Under the dim, humming lights of the concrete bunker, with the thunder of Soviet artillery as their wedding march, Adolf and Eva swore their Aryan purity and were pronounced man and wife. The ceremony was followed by a grim, champagne-less reception, a funereal gathering where Hitler spoke quietly of the old days, of the struggle, and of his impending death. The new Frau Hitler spoke of her pride in becoming the wife of the Führer, a title she would hold for less than 40 hours. Immediately following this macabre celebration, Hitler retreated to an adjoining room with his secretary, Traudl Junge. He was now ready to perform his final official act, the dictation of his last will and his political testament. The documents are a stunning and terrifying window into the mind of a man on the verge of suicide, a mind utterly devoid of remorse and completely detached from reality. The political testament was not a sober reflection on his failures, but a final, venomous tirade. He blamed the war not on his own aggression, but on international Jewry and its helpers. He railed against the German army for its betrayals and its failures. And in a final chilling act of nihilism, he expelled the now traitorous Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party and appointed as his successors the last two men he believed were still loyal: Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as the new president of the Reich, and Joseph Goebbels as the new chancellor. His personal will was a more mundane document, concerned mostly with the disposition of his art collection. But it was in the preamble that he made his final, definitive statement to the world. He announced that he and his new wife had chosen death over the disgrace of deposition or capitulation. "My wife and I," he dictated, "choose to die in order to escape the shame of overthrow or surrender. It is our wish that our bodies be burned immediately in the place where I have carried out the greater part of my daily work in the course of a 12-year-long service to my people." The wedding was complete. The final paperwork was signed. The stage was now set for the suicide pact. The final catalyst for Hitler's suicide, the event that pushed him over the psychological precipice, was not a military defeat, but a piece of news from abroad, delivered by a crackling radio broadcast. In the afternoon of April 29th, a BBC news report was picked up by the bunker's radio operator and transcribed for the Führer. The report detailed the fate of his fellow dictator and Axis partner, Benito Mussolini. The Italian Duce, captured by Italian partisans while trying to flee to Switzerland, had been executed, his body and that of his mistress, Clara Petacci, hung upside down by their feet from the girders of a gas station in Milan, to be reviled and mutilated by a vengeful crowd. For Hitler, this news was the confirmation of his deepest and most primal fear. The image of his friend and ally's public degradation horrified him. He had always been obsessed with the idea of his own posthumous image, the idea of his body being captured and put on display as a trophy. The thought of his corpse being paraded through Red Square in Moscow as a spectacle for the Asiatic hordes was, for him, a fate worse than death itself. The news of Mussolini's end solidified his resolve. There would be no capture, no trial, no public humiliation. His exit from the world stage would be on his own terms, and he would ensure that there was nothing left for his enemies to defile. His paranoia now reached its zenith. He began to doubt the loyalty of everyone and everything, even the poison he had procured for his own suicide. The cyanide capsules, which had been supplied by Himmler's SS, were now suspect. Was it possible that Himmler, the ultimate traitor, had supplied him with a weak or fake dose, a ruse to allow him to be captured alive? To test the poison's efficacy, Hitler ordered a grim and final experiment. He decided to use his beloved Alsatian, Blondie, as his test subject. Dr. Werner Hasse, one of the physicians remaining in the bunker, was summoned to administer the cyanide capsule to the dog. He knelt down, forced the dog's jaws open, and crushed the small glass vial with a pair of pliers. Blondie died almost instantly, collapsing as if struck by lightning. The poison was good. The scene had a profoundly disturbing effect on the bunker's inhabitants. The dog had been a constant presence, a small island of non-political affection in a sea of paranoia and fear. For many of the secretaries and staff, the cold-blooded killing of the dog was more shocking and more real than the distant, abstract death of the city above them. Eva Hitler, in particular, was said to have been inconsolable, weeping openly at the death of the animal she had grown to love. But for Hitler, it was the final, necessary confirmation. He then gave orders for Blondie's puppies to be taken out into the Chancellery garden and shot by his dog handler, a final brutal act of severing all earthly ties. All that remained was to say his farewells. The time was now set for the following afternoon. The afternoon of April 30th was a study in choreographed finality. Around 2:30 p.m., Hitler summoned his inner circle for a final, formal farewell. A small, somber congregation assembled in the corridor outside his private suite. There were the last true believers, Joseph and Magda Goebbels. There was the ever-present, malevolent Martin Bormann. There were the remaining generals, Krebs and Bergdorf, and his loyal SS adjutant, Otto Gunsch. And there were the women of his court, his secretaries, Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, and his vegetarian cook, Constanze Manzierli. One by one, they filed into the small antechamber. Hitler, now a pale, shuffling ghost of the man who had once mesmerized millions, stood alongside Eva Hitler. He was dressed in his final funereal uniform, a clean jacket and black trousers. Eva wore a dark dress with a blue collar. The Führer's handshake was limp, his eyes glazed and distant. He murmured a few, almost inaudible words to each of them, words of farewell, of thanks, of absolution for the coming end. It was a brief, sterile, and deeply awkward ceremony, a pathetic anticlimax to a political career that had been built on grand, theatrical spectacle. Traudl Junge would later recall that it felt like he was a ghost, that his soul had already departed his body. After shaking the last hand, Hitler and his wife of less than 2 days turned, and walked through the steel door into his private sitting room. The door was closed behind them by his valet. The remaining members of the court were left in the corridor, a small, lost tribe of the damned. An unspoken but universal understanding settled over them. They were to wait. The Goebbels family retreated to their own quarters. The others sat in the small telephone switchboard room or stood awkwardly in the passageway, the silence broken only by the hum of the generator and the now constant, shuddering impact of Soviet shells striking the Chancellery garden above. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Some tried to make nervous conversation. Others simply sat and stared at the steel door, waiting for the sound that they all knew was coming. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, but was likely only 10 to 15 minutes, the single, sharp report of a gunshot echoed from behind the door. It was a muffled, almost insignificant sound, nearly lost in the ambient noise of the bunker and the war outside. After a few more moments of hesitation, Hitler's valet, Heinz Ling, accompanied by Martin Bormann, slowly opened the steel door. The scene inside was grim and tableau-like. Adolf Hitler was slumped on the blue-and-white sofa, a Walther PPK pistol having fallen from his right hand. A small trickle of blood ran down his right temple, and a pool of it was staining the arm of the sofa. Eva Hitler was beside him, also dead. She had not used a pistol, but had bitten down on a cyanide capsule. A small, almond-like smell of poison hung faintly in the air. The Führer was dead. The 12-year Reich was over. The discovery of the bodies did not trigger panic or chaos in the bunker. Instead, it set in motion the final prearranged act of the Führer's nihilistic last testament. The men who opened the door, Bormann, Ling, and Hitler's SS adjutant Otto Gunsch, were operating on direct, explicit orders. Their task was not to mourn, but to perform their last duty, the complete and utter obliteration of the physical remains of Adolf and Eva Hitler. The fear of their bodies being captured and desecrated, the fear that had been so powerfully reinforced by the fate of Mussolini, was now the single, overriding tactical concern. Following Gunshot's orders, SS guards wrapped Hitler's body in a grey, field blanket, his blood-stained head covered. Eva Hitler's body was carried out separately. The small, grim procession moved up the 4 flights of concrete stairs from the Führerbunker into the Vorbunker, and then up the final flight that led to the emergency exit into the Chancellery Garden. The scene that greeted them outside was a vision of hell. The sky was a bruised, reddish-gray, thick with the smoke of 1,000 fires. The garden itself was a churned, lunar landscape of shell craters and blasted trees. And the air was filled with the ceaseless, deafening roar of Soviet artillery, the shells of the Stalin organs, screaming overhead. It was a hurricane of steel. In a shallow shell crater just a few feet from the bunker exit, the bodies were laid side by side. Several SS guards, who had been ordered to gather every last can of petrol they could find, now appeared with their jerrycans. In their haste and terror, under the constant shellfire, they poured approximately 200 liters of gasoline over the blanket-wrapped corpses. Otto Gunsh then threw a burning rag onto the petrol-soaked pyre. A massive, roaring fireball erupted, a column of greasy, black smoke rising into the Berlin sky. The cremation had begun. For the next several hours, a small group of the remaining true believers stood in the bunker's doorway, intermittently braving the shellfire to watch the horrifying spectacle. They gave a final, stiff-armed Nazi salute to the flames that were consuming their Führer. Men like Bormann, Goebbels and Gunsh would periodically send guards out to add more gasoline to the fire, a desperate attempt to ensure that the intense heat would do its work. The fire was so hot that it warped the steel girders of the bunker's roof, but it was not hot enough to completely obliterate the bodies in the way a proper crematorium would. What remained after the fire died down was a charred, blackened, and unrecognizable mess of bone fragments and ashes. These pathetic, final remnants were gathered up, placed in a canvas bag, and hastily buried in another nearby shell crater, the ground leveled over them. The final act of erasure was complete, or so they believed. The man who had tried to conquer the world had been reduced to a handful of anonymous ashes in a shallow, unmarked grave in the ruins of his own capital. With the Führer's private apocalypse now complete, a new and even more disturbing drama was about to unfold in the lower levels of the bunker. The death of Adolf Hitler had not brought an end to the Wagnerian opera, it had merely set the stage for its most horrific and tragic final act, the fate of the Goebbels family. Joseph Goebbels, the fanatical minister of propaganda, and his wife, Magda, had made a pact that was, in many ways, even more absolute than Hitler's. They had decided not only to take their own lives, but to murder their 6 young children as well. To them, a world without National Socialism, and without Adolf Hitler, was a world in which their children could not, and should not, be allowed to live. On the evening of May 1st, the day after Hitler's suicide, Magda Goebbels began the final, terrible preparations. She summoned her children to her small room in the Vorbunker. They ranged in age from 12-year-old Helga down to 4-year-old Heidi. She told them they were going on a long journey and that they needed to receive an injection to protect them from sickness. The children, who had been living in the bizarre, subterranean world of the bunker for over a week, were accustomed to strange routines. They dutifully lined up as an SS doctor, Helmut Kunz, administered a light dose of morphine under the pretext of a vaccination. As the children grew drowsy and fell asleep in their beds, the final unthinkable act was carried out. There is some historical debate over who physically administered the poison. Dr. Kunz maintained that he refused to do it, and that Magda Goebbels herself took the cyanide capsules from him. Another SS doctor, Ludwig Stumpfegger, who had been present at Hitler's death, was also implicated. But the end result was the same. One by one, as the children slept, a crushed cyanide capsule was placed in each of their mouths. The poison was swift and lethal. Within minutes, all 6 of the Goebbels children were dead, their small bodies neatly arranged in their beds, the girls with ribbons still in their hair. Having completed this horrific act of filial murder, Joseph and Magda Goebbels prepared for their own end. They walked, arm in arm, up the concrete steps into the same shell-pocked chancellery garden where Hitler's body had been burned the day before. The details of their final moments are sparse, but it is believed that they either bit down on their own cyanide capsules or that Goebbels shot his wife and then himself. Their bodies were then partially burned by an SS orderly, as per their final instructions. They had followed their Führer in a final, nihilistic act of loyalty, sacrificing not only their own lives, but the lives of their 6 innocent children, on the funeral pyre of the Third Reich. Their murder-suicide was the ultimate, and most depraved, expression of the regime's cult of personality, a final, chilling testament to the totality of its moral bankruptcy. With the death of both Hitler and Goebbels, the last vestiges of authority within the Führerbunker evaporated. What remained was no longer a court, but a disparate group of survivors, each now concerned with a single primal objective: escape. The command to fight to the last man had died with its author. On the night of May 1st, a plan was hastily formulated for a mass breakout. The remaining military and civilian personnel, numbering in the hundreds, would form up into small groups and attempt to push through the Soviet lines under the cover of darkness, hoping to break out of Berlin to the north and west, and surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Red Army. The breakout began in a state of chaotic, alcohol-fueled desperation. The atmosphere in the bunker, which had been one of oppressive, sober dread, had transformed into a wild, funereal party. The remaining stores of liquor were opened, and many of the soldiers and staff drank themselves into a stupor, a final, nihilistic release before the end. Shortly before midnight, the first groups began to emerge from the emergency exits, plunging into the hellish landscape of a city in its death throes. The night was illuminated by the constant glare of fires and the flash of explosions. The air was thick with smoke and the constant chatter of machine gun fire. The fate of these breakout groups was almost universally grim. Most were cut down by Soviet fire within a few hundred yards of the chancellery as they tried to cross the open ground of the Wilhelmplatz. Others managed to link up with the remnants of German units still fighting in the city and were killed or captured in the final, desperate battles for the Weidendammer Bridge over the River Spree. Only a very small handful, including Hitler's secretaries Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, and the head of the Hitler Youth, Artur Axmann, managed to successfully navigate the labyrinth of ruins and Soviet checkpoints and eventually reach the Allied lines. The most significant and historically debated fate was that of the man who had been the true power in the bunker's final days, Martin Bormann. Bormann left the bunker in one of the lead breakout groups, alongside the last commander of the Hitler Youth, Artur Axmann, and Hitler's final physician, Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger. According to Axmann's later testimony, the group was attempting to follow the armor of a single Tiger tank as it tried to smash its way across the Weidendammer Bridge. The tank was hit by a Soviet anti-tank shell and destroyed. In the ensuing chaos, the group was scattered. Axmann was separated from Bormann and Stumpfegger but later doubled back, and in the dim light near the Lurter train station, he saw 2 bodies, which he identified as Bormann and the doctor. For decades, however, Bormann's fate remained a mystery. He was tried and sentenced to death in absentia at Nuremberg, and rumors of his escape, much like Dirlewanger's, persisted for years, with sightings reported in South America and across the world. The mystery was not definitively solved until 1972, when a construction crew, excavating a site near the Lurter station, unearthed 2 skeletons. Forensic analysis, and later DNA testing in the 1990s, confirmed that one of the skeletons was, without a doubt, that of Martin Bormann. Shards of glass found in the jawbone indicated that he, like so many others, had committed suicide by biting down on a cyanide capsule to avoid capture by the Soviets. The spider at the center of the web had not escaped. He had died anonymously in a ditch, just a mile from the bunker where he had briefly been the most powerful man in a collapsing empire. On the morning of May 2, 1945, the guns in Berlin finally began to fall silent. General Helmuth Weidling, the last commander of the Berlin defense area, had formally surrendered the city to the Soviet forces. For the soldiers of the Red Army, men who had fought their way across 1,000 miles of scorched earth from the ruins of Stalingrad, this was the ultimate, almost mythical moment of victory. They were now the masters of the enemy's capital, the heart of the fascist beast. And the single most sought-after prize in this city of ruins was the Reich Chancellery, and the subterranean bunker that lay beneath it. The first Soviet soldiers to enter the Chancellery complex were from the 79th Guards Rifle Division. They found a scene of utter chaos and surreal destruction. The once opulent halls were a burned-out, rubble-strewn maze. The bunker itself was a bizarre tableau of abandoned lives. Uniforms, papers, and empty liquor bottles were strewn everywhere. In the infirmary, they found the bodies of several German soldiers who had been shot by their own officers for cowardice. But the main prize, Hitler himself, was nowhere to be found. It was only when a captured German officer revealed the story of the suicides and the cremation that the Soviets began their grim search of the Chancellery garden. Following the Germans' directions, a team from SMERSH, the Red Army's counterintelligence agency, began to probe the shell craters near the bunker exit. It did not take them long. In a shallow pit, buried under a thin layer of earth, they discovered the partially burned, unrecognizable remains of 2 bodies, along with the corpses of 2 dogs. The bodies were immediately taken to a makeshift morgue that had been set up in the Berlin suburb of Buck for analysis. The Soviets, under the direct and paranoid supervision of Joseph Stalin himself, were desperate to confirm, with absolute certainty, that they had found the body of their arch-nemesis. The forensic examination was meticulous. The Soviets brought in Kathy Huseman, the dental assistant to Hitler's personal dentist, who had been captured during the breakout attempt. Using her detailed knowledge of the Führer's notoriously bad teeth, and comparing them to his old dental X-rays which had been located in the Chancellery files, she was able to positively identify the dental work on the charred jawbone found with a male corpse. The autopsy report, kept top secret by Stalin for decades, confirmed it. The body was that of Adolf Hitler. They had found their man. But Stalin, in an act of profound and lasting historical cynicism, chose to suppress this finding. He was deeply paranoid that the Western Allies might try to use a living Hitler as a puppet or a rallying point in a future conflict. For the rest of his life, he would publicly maintain that Hitler had escaped, probably to Spain or South America, under the protection of the British or Americans. The truth of Hitler's death, and the physical evidence of his body, was thus locked away in the deepest vaults of the Soviet archives. The man who had craved a glorious Wagnerian exit from the world stage had instead become the subject of a tawdry ghost story, his final, pathetic end obscured for half a century by the propaganda and paranoia of the new Cold War he had helped to create. While the grim, subterranean drama of the Führerbunker was reaching its squalid conclusion, the city of Berlin was dying in a symphony of unimaginable violence. The final battle for the capital of the Third Reich was not a tactical engagement, it was a Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods, a deliberate and vengeful act of annihilation enacted by a Red Army that had fought its way across a continent of ruins. For the 2 million Soviet soldiers who encircled the city, this was not just the final battle of the war. It was the culmination of 4 years of suffering and a brutal act of historical retribution for the 27 million Soviet citizens who had perished under the Nazi onslaught. The city's defense was a pathetic and suicidal fantasy. The defenders were a cobbled-together collection of the last, exhausted remnants of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, supplemented by thousands of boys from the Hitler Youth, some as young as 12, and old men of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, many of whom were First World War veterans in their 60s. Armed with single-shot anti-tank weapons and ancient rifles, they were thrown into the path of the Soviet armored spearheads in a futile, last-ditch sacrifice. The fighting was savage, a street-by-street, room-by-room battle fought in the shattered, labyrinthine ruins of the city. For the 1.5 million civilians still trapped in Berlin, it was an apocalypse. They were caught between the fanatical SS death squads who were hanging anyone deemed a defeatist, and the overwhelming, indiscriminate firepower of the Soviet artillery, which fired over 2 million shells into the city during the final 2 weeks of the battle. There was no electricity, no water, and no food. The city's population was driven underground, huddling in cellars and U-Bahn tunnels, their world reduced to a terrifying, percussive darkness. And as the Soviet troops advanced, they brought with them a wave of retributive violence, particularly against the female population, an explosion of mass rape that remains one of the darkest and most painful chapters of the war's end. On May 2nd, the last pockets of resistance were silenced. On May 7th, at his headquarters in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl, acting on the authority of Hitler's appointed successor, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, signed the instrument of unconditional surrender to the Western Allies. The next day, May 8, in a ceremony in Berlin demanded by Stalin to underscore the Red Army's decisive role, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed a second, identical document of surrender to the Soviet High Command. The war in Europe was officially over. It did not end with a miracle, or a negotiated peace, or a final, glorious battle. It ended in the total, unconditional, and catastrophic obliteration of the regime that had started it. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted for 12 years and 4 months, and it had died in a squalid bunker, amidst the ruins of its own capital, leaving behind a continent in ashes and a legacy of human suffering that would echo for generations. In the final accounting, the story of Hitler's last 10 days is more than just the chronicle of a dictator's death. It is a story that holds within it the DNA of the entire Nazi regime, a perfect, condensed microcosm of the principles upon which it was built and the reasons for its spectacular and catastrophic collapse. The Führerbunker was not just a place. It was a state of mind, the final, logical destination for an ideology that was fueled from its very inception by a profound and deliberate detachment from reality. The regime that had been born in the beer halls of Munich, powered by grand, theatrical rallies and a hypnotic belief in its own destiny, died in a damp, concrete cellar, surrounded by sycophants and traitors. The man who had mesmerized a nation with visions of a 1,000-year empire spent his final hours consumed by petty squabbles, personal betrayals, and the fate of his dog. The entire episode is a study in the pathetic, squalid reality that lies beneath the polished veneer of totalitarian power. It reveals that the architects of a world historical tragedy were not gods or demons, but deeply flawed, corrupt, and ultimately pathetic human beings, unable to escape the consequences of their own monstrous actions. The events in the bunker also serve as a final, chilling testament to the core principles of the Nazi movement: nihilism and self-destruction. Hitler's final act was not one of remorse or of a leader trying to save his people from further suffering. It was an act of pure, spiteful negation. His Nero decree, of March 1945, had already ordered the complete destruction of all German infrastructure, a command that the German people were unworthy of survival if they could not win his war. His suicide was the ultimate expression of this sentiment, a final, theatrical act of self-immolation that was mirrored by the murder-suicide of his most loyal disciple, Joseph Goebbels, and his family. They did not just accept defeat, they embraced annihilation, attempting to pull the entire world down with them into their own private abyss. And yet, the story's ultimate legacy is one of a profound and terrifying void. The bodies were burned, the bunker was eventually sealed, and the ruins of Berlin were cleared away. But the questions remain. How could a modern, educated, and civilized nation fall under the spell of such a man? How could an entire state apparatus be given over to the pursuit of such a delusional and genocidal ideology? The story of the bunker offers no easy answers. It offers only a stark, clinical, and deeply disturbing portrait of the end. It serves as a permanent, cautionary tale, a reminder that the line between civilization and barbarism, between grand ambition and squalid self-destruction, is terrifyingly thin, and that the final, desperate battle against delusion is one that must be fought not in a bunker, but in the mind of every generation.